Welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about libertarianism or libertarian accounts of free will. I'll start off with a little warning though. So if you're engaged in politics at all, you may have come across the term libertarianism. Um, but libertarianism in politics is a very different thing than libertarianism about free will. So libertarianism about politics is a political view about how governments should be structured, about the rights of individuals, whereas libertarianism about free will is a metaphysical and moral view about whether we have free will and whether what free will involves. Importantly, you can be a libertarian about free will without being a political libertarian. Now, it's sometimes the case that libertarians about free will are also political libertarians. So the well-known, or perhaps the most well-known political libertarian in philosophy is an American philosopher called Robert Nozick. Um, he was both a political libertarian and a libertarian about free will. But there's nothing about either of these views that means that you have to hold the other, or that you're somehow mistaken about not holding the other. So, for example, you could be a political libertarian and also be a compatibilist. So you could think there should be a very small government, and we should have we should have a lot of rights to do whatever we want, and yet still think that free will is compatible with the truth of causal determinism. And it might also be that you could be a socialist or a communist or even an authoritarian and still think that we have the kind of free will that libertarians about free will say we have. So these things come apart. I mention this now and I'm making a big deal about it because in my experience, it's very often that at least some people will confuse these two ideas. And since you have to write essays on free will, one of the questions is about libertarianism, you might think that, when you look up things about libertarianism, you might get things about political libertarianism. And then you might include things about political libertarianism, which are irrelevant to answering a question about libertarianism, about free will. So really just don't make this mistake. Really be careful because that you're going to be answering the wrong question. So let's turn now to libertarianism about free will. So libertarians are usually incompatibilists, right? So incompatibilists believe that if causal determinism is true, then nobody has free will. Whereas it's true that libertarians are usually incompatibilists, but what makes them distinct from incompatibilists is that they assert that free will exists. So if you're an incompatibilist and a libertarian, you'd think that both that compatibilism is false and that free will exists and it involves what libertarians say it does. But libertarians don't need to assert that compatibilism is false, because most fundamentally, their view is about the truth, the existence of free will, and that free will that we have involves indeterminism. You could be a libertarian and still allow that, we have free will, involves indeterminism, but it's still possible to have free will in a world with causal determinism. That's a possible view. It's not very usual. It would be very much a fringe view, given that most libertarians, you can safely assume, are incompatibilists.
So quick interjection here into the lecture. In the lecture itself, if you've done some of the reading, you might see that I've used a perhaps non-standard definition of what libertarianism is. So the way I defined it is that libertarianism is the view that we have free will and it involves indeterminism. Now you might have noticed, if you've read the chapter of the introduction to Four Views on Free Will, that other people don't define libertarianism this way. And indeed, it's actually pretty standard to define libertarianism such that it means that you have to be an incompatibilist. So here, Mamo Vargas, very much in line with many other authors, defines libertarianism as in part the view that free will is incompatible with determinism. Now, if this is your definition of free will, then all libertarians are incompatibilists. Now, I don't think that's the only way to define libertarianism. In fact, I have a preference for how I defined it, partly because I've met people, researchers on free will, who say they're libertarians, but they also say they're not incompatibilists. So that's why I prefer my definition to this one. Just be aware that these are two different definitions that are around. So be careful. Be careful about your definition. I would err on the side of caution and go with the standard one for most of the time. But if you do go with a non-standard one, emphasize that it's non-standard. Give your explanation. There you go. It's just another way of emphasizing something I wanted to point out. I pointed out in the first lecture, and I really want to emphasize, is that it really depends. Philosophy often really depends on how people are defining their terms. You have to be very, very careful that you understand how people define it, and then that you're clear on how you define your terms. When you are, people can't be confused by simple and obvious things. Anyway, end of interjection.
So in today's lecture, we're going to consider three things. We're going to consider two main forms of libertarianism: event causal libertarianism and agent causal libertarianism. And then we'll consider each of the libertarian responses to the basic argument that we get from event causalism and agent causalism. And then we're going to consider the luck problem for libertarianism. So given that libertarians are usually incompatibilists, let's think more about what incompatibilism is. So incompatibilism is the view that causal determinism rules out free will. Or perhaps more generally, it's the view that determinism is incompatible or rules out free will. So let's consider two forms of determinism. One is theological determinism. So if you're a theological determinist, you think that God determines what happens. So in your view, it would be that God is creating the universe, and in effect, he's writing a big story about what's happening. And in that story is just everything that happens in the world. And because God writes it in the big story of the world, that's just what happens. You'd be a theological determinist then. You wouldn't be making any claim about connections between different things that happen, between different events. Rather, the fact that you're attending this lecture or you're attending Glasgow University would just be a matter of God deciding that that's what was going to happen. Another form of determinism, and one which is the primary focus of contemporary debates about free will and moral responsibility, is causal determinism. So causal determinism is a view about causes. It's about the connection between causes and effects. So causal determinism most fundamentally says that causes necessitate their effects. So if one particular thing causes another thing, it was always going to cause that. So for example, you have X and Y at a particular time, then X must cause Y. To have a more vivid example, suppose that you have one ball and another ball. Now, if the first ball, let's call it ball 1, is going to hit ball 2 and move it at a particular time, then it was always going to do that. There was just the way the world is set up was such that when ball 1 hit ball 2, it was always going to move at the distance that it did. The cause there, the first ball moving, necessitates the effect, the other ball moving a certain distance. Now, importantly, with causal determinism, it's not just a view about individual causes necessitating individual effects, but rather that the entire universe is sort of governed by this kind of connection between causes and effects. And one way to put this is that the laws of nature are deterministic. So if the laws of nature are in effect the kind of rules of the universe, the rules of life, the rules of the game, involves things about like gravity, the speed of light, and so on. These kinds of laws are deterministic if they result in particular events only leading to other particular events. So if the laws of nature are deterministic, then when ball 1 hits ball 2 at that particular time, then it was always going to move it the distance that it did. You couldn't really do otherwise because the laws were such, and that given the kind of conditions we're in, that ball moved with the force that it was moved with was always going to move the other ball the distance that it did. Nothing could be different. Now, for a long time, the idea that the laws of nature were deterministic was quite popular in science, but these days, scientists are a lot more open to the idea that the laws of nature are indeterministic or probabilistic. And indeed, philosophers are also open to the idea that causation can be indeterministic or probabilistic. So the difference here is that if causation or the laws of nature are deterministic, then only one thing is going to happen. In the right kind of conditions or in a particular set of conditions, you're only going to get a particular outcome. So a particular input, particular cause is going to give you a particular output. But if the laws of nature are deterministic, that allows for causation to be indeterministic or probabilistic. That means that you can have a particular set of initial conditions or a particular cause, and you might not get the exact effect. So, take ball one hitting ball two, a very simple example. If the connection between ball one and ball two is indeterministic, then if ball one hits ball two, then it's not set in stone. It's not determined that ball two will move a particular distance. Maybe ball two might not move at all if there's an indeterministic connection there. So if causation is indeterministic or probabilistic, then causes just raise the chances of particular effects. So if you have a particular set of initial conditions, the ball is sitting on a table, and then you hit it with a particular force, then this will raise the chance of ball two moving a particular distance. If the connection between the cause here and the effect, the ball moving, is indeterministic, then the fact that you have the cause occurring in those conditions doesn't mean that you can say with certainty that the effect will occur, but you can say that it's more or less likely given that causes increase the chance of effects.